Since 1970 to this day, the United States of America have dedicated February as Black History Month to remember the victories as well as the tragic events that occurred before and during the civil rights movement in Alabama. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, in Alabama, Southeast America, certain events happened that initiated the civil rights movement, a movement that strived to diminish the racial segregation of African Americans from whites in the community. During the 1950s in Alabama, African Americans were forced to abide by the rules of bus segregation, which meant whites had priority in terms of seating. In 1955, black Alabama citizen Rosa Parks took a stand against these discriminating laws by refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Parks stated in her autobiography, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, no. The only tired I was tired of giving in." The situation led to her arrest until later that evening when she was released on bail, and where she was greeted by Edgar Daniel Nixon, chapter president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Parks had previously joined the NAACP as chapter secretary alongside her husband Raymond Parks, who was already a long-time member. The reason Parks joined the NAACP was to bring justice and freedom to African Americans living in America, and when Nixon heard the news of Parks' arrest, he believed he had found the brave individual who was willing to stand for her rights in court. Whilst Nixon, Rosa, and Raymond Parks and Rosa's mother discussed the upcoming trial, the idea of the blacks of Montgomery, Alabama, uniting to boycott buses on the day of the court case became apparent. As Parks was being given a suspended sentence, the black community of Montgomery were gathering in great number in protest against the segregated seating laws. The Women's Political Council, who were an organization of black women fighting for civil rights, had previously distributed flyers informing of the event, leading to the large scale of attendance that not even optimists had predicted. Support also came from ministers announcing the protest in Sunday services, as well as a newspaper that put out a front-page article concerning the forthcoming event. The boycott lasted until December the 21st, 1956, for a total of 381 days, after the community of Montgomery appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court regarding the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution earlier that year. The amendment contradicted the current laws concerning segregation on buses, stating that no matter what race, equal rights must be acted upon under state and federal laws. However, among the positive atmosphere of this progression, much of the community in Montgomery reacted through resistance and violence. White Americans began shooting into the buses in attempts of inflicting pain on the African Americans of the city. The violence continued through to January 1957, where black churches and black leaders' homes were bombed, leading to the arrest of several members of white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan. An iconic social activist who was assassinated for his beliefs and efforts throughout the civil rights movement was Baptist minister Martin Luther King. King had great involvement with the bus boycott as he was chosen to be the protest leader and spokesman. He was decided as leader of the civil rights movement primarily because of his high position in the Montgomery Improvement Association, a forum of black leaders based in the community. His strongly positive character and peaceful attitude towards the violence that was being targeted at the African American community remained an admirable figure of hope for the people of Montgomery to look up to throughout the duration of the civil rights movement, and still to this day stands as an example of a life living in peace and equality across the globe. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a group of mainly ministers that King was involved with, stated that not one hair of one head of one person should be harmed, further emphasizing King's positive outlook on the negative situation. It was during the March on Washington, a rally organized for the sole purpose of exposing the injustices felt by African Americans over the country, where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The deliverance was the climatic aspect of the civil rights movement that stood as a symbol of peace, a message intended to end the segregation conflict. All men are created equal, a statement made by King during the speech reflecting the suffering that African Americans had endured, but more importantly was a lesson for humanity, which was to strive for a harmonious future. Where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had arranged a campaign to register to vote, brutal violence broke out amongst white supremacists and peaceful protesters. During these dismal times, King's ever-growing recognition brought attention to the scenes of conflict, resulting in a positive reaction from people across America, where individuals and groups gathered to march in protest against this violence. However, the peaceful protesting only intensified the tension between King and the radicals who did not stand for his views, leading to the renowned activist's death on April 4, 1968. King was assassinated by racist escaped convict James Earl Ray, who shot the leader who had inspired many to stand up against segregation and discrimination with the aim to achieve world peace. The news of King's death fled riots throughout America, and President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that there would be a national day of mourning. This increase in violence, however, drew the world's attention to the ongoing discrimination occurring in Alabama with the help of reporters and photographers who travelled to cover the events. These news stories, and images in particular, opened the eyes of the rest of the world to the tragic happenings, ultimately assisting in bringing the conflict to an end. Photojournalists captured the events in order to expose the violent behaviour of white supremacists through documentary graphic imagery, which many thought was distasteful because it showed a lack of respect towards the African Americans who were being brutally attacked in the images. However, in truth, these images were a voice to the people who seemingly had no escape from this life of torture, a broadcast to the rest of the world. American photojournalist Bill Hudson is known for capturing some of the most iconic scenes of the brutality and protest that happened throughout the civil rights movement. Many of his compositions present white police officers and dogs violently attacking black peaceful protesters, which, when were published to the public, resulted in a reaction of outrage and anger from the viewers. Capturing these protests in Montgomery and Selma, as did Hudson, was a dangerous job, and the photographer's wife recalls that he was physically targeted by those who did not want the images to be taken that exposed their barbaric behavior. Out of drive to make a positive change to the unfair treatment of the African Americans in Alabama and to help them achieve the goal they wanted to in their protest, Hudson's determination and images were highly admired by other photographers who were documenting the civil rights movement. Hudson's most renowned image of the young black American Walter Galston being attacked by a police dog, implying a strong sense of racial segregation, played a significant role in exposing the violence and representing the events to the rest of the world. The picture featured in papers across America, bringing masses of people's attention to Montgomery, standing as one of the primary sources of realization. Hudson's work is a prime example of the power of photojournalism and how a singular image can drastically shift the outcome of events. It is important that there are photojournalists like Hudson who capture the scenes of war and conflict to inform the public, as photos represent a realist documentation of events. Photojournalist Bruce Davidson is another among many individuals who documented the civil rights movement through powerful imagery. Much like Hudson, he captured scenes throughout the period that presented the cruel treatment of African Americans conducted by white Americans. However, many of Davidson's images show the willpower of African Americans striving to fight for their rights, establishing a sense of positivity and hope considering the dire situation. Davidson wanted to make known of the violence targeted at these people in an attempt to achieve support from the rest of the world, as well as respecting the individuals by capturing their determination and triumphs, representing them as powerful people. Throughout his collection of images are recognizable figures of the time, including Martin Luther King, who stood as a symbol of power and hope. He captured him in a way that reflected his character that was loved by many, constantly surrounded by people following him in his righteous path. These images of King, among the other compositions that celebrate the African American strength through these difficult times, were a sign of their victory that remains a symbol of the importance of equality today. On the other hand, he also shot the darker side of the events, where African Americans were being dragged along the street by white police officers, and depressing scenes where whites are unwilling to coexist happily with blacks. This proved that the African Americans of Alabama were severely affected by the retaliations of peaceful protesting, and that there wasn't always a positive outcome. But again, similar to Hudson's work, these documentary images of the negativity helped resolve the situation because of worldwide recognition. Both photographers have shown the importance of photojournalism in times of conflict and affairs, where even a singular image can inspire people to make a positive change. The photos taken throughout the civil rights movement stand today as important a message as it was during the time, to treat others equally, no matter what race, gender, or sexuality.